Once again, hello for my full semester and second 8 weeks government classes in the fall of 2019. I'm recording this on the first day of November. So we will have all these recordings, I anticipate, by certainly the second week of November. And so we will have the 15 chapters that we will have for our final in December recorded. And we have, of course, some old recordings that are already available for you to review if you'd like. But here's our update for Chapter 14, Bureaucracy. And of course, this is also part of our third exam, which will cover chapters 11 through 15. As you note here, Chapter 14, dealing with bureaucracy, I refer to it as the unofficial branch of government. And you can see at the beginning of this chapter, like all the other chapters that we've covered, the authors of this text help to set the table and to think about this particular topic and to see how it applies to our lives today. So we all drink water, and so here we can see the importance of being able to have clean water and to see where we would get that. And also consider the information that we may get from bureaucracy and what happens if a bureaucracy fails, as pointed out here on pages 552, dealing with the city in Michigan known as Flint, Michigan. So you can see here the other areas that we may rely upon some sort of government or bureaucratic organization for information. A weather forecast, safety on the highway, making sure that our checks are mailed, that we are able to get clean drinking water from a fountain, and that we know what kind of calories we're getting when we eat something. So lots of different ways in which we get information from a bureaucratic organization. Many of you are perhaps working on your research papers involving some form of bureaucratic organization. So we can see some really powerful bureaucratic organizations such as the NSA. And I would imagine many of you are interested in the NSA. Perhaps some of you would like to work for the NSA. And the NSA has a tremendous amount of influence and power. As you can see here, what was referenced in a past text on a daily account, possibly reviewing up to 1.7 billion emails and phone calls and other communications every day. The security to the NSA is unforgiving. There is no possibility of being able to just accidentally wander upon the territory of the NSA. So it's a very highly secure and very secretive organization. Now, we do see that there are bureaucratic organizations at the state level as well as the federal level, and we can certainly see how these organizations are very close to our daily activities. We've already referenced that when we've looked over chapters 1, chapter 3, and now here with chapter 14. But we can consider, for many of you, if you're right here on the campus of NEO, if you live here in Miami, and you think about having Tar Creek that gets backed up and what it might then mean for the floodwaters of that creek and how that's related to the depth level of Grand Lake. And we can see partly the state bureaucracy of Grand River Dam Authority in its decision to have Grand Lake deeper than what the city officials of Miami would like for that lake to be. So here we can see the power and the influence of a state bureaucracy in this case. And there is actually some conflict with a federal bureaucracy. And so it involves two local communities here in two different counties in northeastern Oklahoma, Ottawa County with Miami and Delaware County with Grove, where predominantly in Delaware County there would be this desire to have Grand Lake deeper so you can have larger boats on the lake all the time. And in Miami, you would like to have Grand Lake not so deep so that it could fill in with more water faster in cases of flooding, which would then decrease the pressure around the area of Tar Creek and its likelihood of being flooded. And there has been support from a federal level for the city of Miami, an organization known as FERC, Federal Energy Regulation Commission. However, there has been a determination with other areas, such as the Defense Department, regulations written by the U.S. Senator here in the state of Oklahoma, to overrule FERC and to support the Grand River Dam Authority, the state bureaucracy, over a competing federal bureaucracy, in this case, part of the Department of Energy, as you can see here from the seal representing FERC. So one of the interesting stories and the conflicts involving different bureaucratic agencies, different levels of government, different cities, and different demands on a body of water. Really fascinating story that does come back into the case in which people's homes and businesses can be flooded. And we know that reality right here, looking out my window at my office and the possibility of, at any time based on heavy rains, Tar Creek getting flooded. Well, there are powers of the bureaucracy involving other branches of government and the possibility of limiting those branches of government's power, such as the presidency. When you read through the Constitution, it's understandable that people would assume that it's the chief executive that is in control of the bureaucracy, and by many standards that would be correct. However, if we look at just the size of bureaucracy and the expertise of bureaucrats, we can see ways in which those organizations can limit the power of the very individual and constitutional entity that is supposed to be in charge of the bureaucracy. And so, but let's think about it on some of the explanations why this bureaucracy could limit, in that case, the power of the president. By the sheer size of many of these bureaucratic organizations, how could one individual be able to control it? If you just look at the building of the Pentagon and look at the people then that would be inside the Pentagon, the number of people that would be supporting particular policies, being able to advance some policies over others, slow down some policies. How could one individual be able to just completely shake up the structure and the motivations of the Defense Department? It would be really pretty much impossible to do that. Even if a president's there 8 years and firing top officials the whole time and replacing other individuals, the ability to completely change the Pentagon, just really can't see that happening. So just the sheer size of bureaucratic organizations, we can see ways in which a president's power would be limited. And then consider the expertise of bureaucrats, the jobs that they would have. So those individuals in the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, what kind of presidents can really converse with them and understand their goals, their methods, their training? There's not been very many presidents that could do that. In the modern era in which there has been a NASA going back to the 1950s, we've really had one president that might be able to hang in there with these scientists, the real live rocket scientists of NASA, and that would be Jimmy Carter, who has a degree in nuclear engineering from the Naval Academy. So he'd be up there, and he could talk their language. But most individuals who've been president just wouldn't have that capacity. So once again, that's a way in which parts of the bureaucracy can have some power over the president by just their knowledge, their use of technology, and their expertise. And we look at traits of bureaucracy. They've been around for quite some time. The German social scientist Max Weber put this information together and to look at what is a bureaucracy. We generally look at bureaucracies as government organizations, but you could look at these traits of bureaucracy to explain a non-government entity that would still have hierarchical authority, job specialization, and formalized rules. So not the only ones that would do that. So let's look at those three. Hierarchical authority, the chain of command. So this is just looking at the structure of the command on board one ship in the U.S. Navy. We're going to use the Navy as our example here. So you can see the complexities there. This would not be something that I would ask you to, define or be part of a test, but just to absorb the complexities of bureaucracy. There has to be a chain of command. Everyone knows the individuals that they would answer to and the people that would take orders from a particular individual and then would receive orders from other individuals. So part of that chain of command, the hierarchical authority. Then there's job specialization. Again, within the Navy, all kinds of specialized jobs, all kinds of specialized training, all kinds of required orders on where people need to be at what particular times. So can you imagine when we think about individuals and having certain kind of responsibilities, and you probably know some people like this. So if you're 18, 19 years old and you wonder what kind of responsibilities you can really accept or should accept, let's just consider that there are 18 and 19-year-olds that are on board a flight deck of an aircraft carrier right now. And their job is to stand in a particular place, follow particular orders, give particular commands at certain times. And if they don't do that, they may be blown off this deck. They may die in a terrible way. And so it is literally life or death to obey particular orders in this situation. Extremely important. And so there we can see parts of the responsibilities of job specialization. And then there are rules. There are rules that might in some ways seem petty and rather obscure. And for anyone who's been in the military, you can probably relate to that. And this is a fantastic movie that brings up that segment of bureaucracy known as formalized rules. In this movie, The Caine Mutiny came out in the 1950s. I would urge everyone to watch this movie. You have Captain Queeg, who is now trying to defend himself on why he should not have been removed from command aboard the ship and taken over by the other officers. This is a tremendous undertaking within the Navy for something like this to happen. Officers who do this and are found guilty of a mutiny, and there's not understandable for them to have taken over command of a ship, can be executed. So it is an extremely massive undertaking to do. But it did happen. This is based on a true story. And in this case, you had Queeg claiming that one of the reasons why the crew did not like him was that he was a very petty officer in terms of following the different orders and rules within the dress codes of the Navy. But his argument was that fining sailors for having their shirt tails out was actually a good explanation or a good cause for punishment. Because when sailors had their shirt tails out and they were down in the bowels of the ship and they would get their shirt tails caught up in equipment, they could be injured. And if they were injured, they couldn't do their job. They had to go to sick bay. And if they were there, somebody else had to do their job. And that would then hurt the overall balance and the use of manpower on board the ship. And so he strongly argued, yes, absolutely, he would fine every sailor that had his shirt tail out while he was on duty. So a very interesting way of looking at the importance of formalized rules here in this film, The Caine Mutiny. You ought to watch it. Very interesting film. Now, when we look at bureaucracy and we look at bureaucrats, and a lot of times the complaint about them is that they're a faceless bureaucrat. In other words, that they just follow those orders and they don't really have any kind of human connection to the people that they're making those orders to. I would first say that that's not necessarily always accurate. But secondly, there are times in which perhaps it's necessary for the bureaucrat to in fact be faceless, to not have any particular emotion in regards to the process that that bureaucrat is responsible for. And that may mean that they don't really think about the outcome at a particular human level. But if they did, perhaps they would not be able to carry out the process. And that may be extremely important, even though it's in areas that we may not find to be that pleasant. Military, of course, certainly comes to mind here, but it could also be involved in some sort of areas of healthcare, when decisions are made in terms of fire protection even, or other areas of security, but also just simply processing tax returns. There can't be a way of saying we're going to make a special exemption for one individual even if they have not followed the rules. There needs to be that continuity, and perhaps being a faceless bureaucrat allows that to happen. With that said, there are plenty of bureaucrats that are in contact with the public. They're in contact with the public all the time. And so I have some of them listed here, as you can see, and they're referred to as state-level bureaucrats. So a state-level bureaucrat would be someone who's in contact with the public and then makes decisions on a case-by-case level. And so you do give considerable authority to those individual bureaucrats. So consider a police officer. Does a police officer give out a ticket every time that police officer sees someone speeding? We know that's not the case. Do teachers treat every student exactly the same way? They may not be. They certainly judge people based on their different personalities, on how they might treat one another. And the same can be said with the game warden and the process of educating the public about the environment. So there you can see different roles for the street level bureaucrat. They're in contact with the public and they make decisions on a case-by-case basis. So clearly we can see that police officers are not faceless. Teachers are not faceless type of bureaucrats. The power of bureaucracy in large part comes from Congress, and it's referred to as administrative discretion, as we can see here. And that's where Congress gives the bureaucracy the discretion to make its own rules and regulations. Coming back to the Navy, we would not assume that it's Congress writing the rules and regulations for the Navy in almost all cases. It would be the Navy writing its own rules and regulations, and would have that power to develop those rules and regulations. So that's where the reference there to the discretion of the bureaucratic agency. Now, we've talked about the Iron Triangle and a couple of other areas, so let me just once again bring that out to your attention to look at the use of the Iron Triangles. We've talked about it with interest groups in Chapter 11, and then legislative committees in Chapter 12. So don't really go into detail here except to say, once again, be very familiar with the power of these three groups working together, and you can find that described on page 564 in your text. So just think about how we've described in other settings how the Iron Triangle is developed and how it carries out relationships of these three groups. Within the Iron Triangle, then, you have interest groups that are connected to bureaucratic agencies. So thinking about that relationship among those three groups, those three organizations within the Iron Triangle, here you can see that there are some interest groups that would clearly want to see the success or maintain the power and authority of particular bureaucratic agencies. Mainly, those would be bureaucratic agencies that are bestowing contracts to these particular interest groups, and the lobbying firms that represent these businesses. So for example, General Dynamics, McDonnell Douglas, General Electric are all defense contractors, and then would serve bureaucratic agencies such as the Navy and the Air Force and the Army, and would get benefits then from working with those organizations. All right, so once again, just consider as we leave that segment to think about how clientele groups benefit from the success of bureaucratic agencies and how they work together. All right, for our sake here then, we're looking at the differences on how people get jobs within the bureaucratic agencies. So you have two main ways here. It's really these two ways, merit and patronage. You can read about this on page 556 and 558. Increasingly, more and more bureaucratic agencies and the bureaucrats within those agencies get jobs through merit, jobs based on ability. There was a time in the United States where to get a job within a bureaucracy was primarily through political support, patronage. So you can boil this down to a phrase that we probably all are familiar with, who you know versus what you know. So what should be? Patronage would be who you know, and merit should be what you know. So which one of those two do we find to be most important in trying to understand the use of bureaucracy and who should get a job within bureaucracy? I would imagine most of us like the idea of merit, what you know, over who you know. Now, the whole creation of having a merit-based bureaucracy was really focused on the Garfield assassination. This occurred in the 1880s, and President Garfield was actually shot and eventually died. It took several weeks before that happened. Just did not have the medical expertise and technology to be able to save his life. And so he was shot by a disgruntled office seeker. This was a time in which presidents pretty much at least one day a week would spend their time handling requests by people who wanted jobs within the government. And so Charles Guiteau wanted a job. Garfield was advised by other individuals that he was unstable. He certainly proved that by unfortunately shooting the president. But Garfield then decided not to give him a job. And from that, there was a greater demand to start to increase more and more merit-based applications and determinations for jobs within the government, within bureaucracy. So this became the impetus of changing the qualifications for a lot of bureaucratic positions, more based on merit instead of patronage. Within bureaucracy, you see different ways of promoting certain types of bureaucratic agencies. And the individuals who are able to do that are called bureaucratic entrepreneurs. This is one of the best examples, really the best example of a bureaucratic entrepreneur. So again, someone who is able to promote a bureaucratic agency. This individual is J. Edgar Hoover, and he was the director of the FBI from the 1920s until his death in the early 1970s. So he directed the FBI for an incredible number of years and had a great deal of authority and was able to really expand and promote the FBI. Now, when you think about that, so just consider how some bureaucratic agencies might be able to be promoted more successfully than others. Let's consider then how bureaucracies hold on to power and how they might lose power. This is a really interesting book. Came out in the 1950s called Inside Bureaucracy by Anthony Downs. And it looks at bureaucracies in an organic way. meaning that a bureaucratic agency has a lifespan, just like any living thing. And that's why we call it organic. So there's a beginning, an infancy, an adolescence, an adulthood, an old age, and eventually death. That's the way to look at a bureaucratic agency, just like any kind of living thing. Do we view bureaucratic agencies as living things? In many ways we don't. However, the bureaucrats are living, so why not look at it as a living thing? Inside bureaucracy, Anthony Nouns, the process of bureaucratic agencies trying to survive. And the way to survive that then is in some ways perhaps to combat reform, but maybe sometimes reform may actually help a bureaucratic agency survive. So let me just emphasize before we go into this detail that Anthony Downs would say that in order to survive, bureaucratic agencies must either not solve a problem, because once they solve a problem, it may mean that they no longer need to survive. So either not solve the problem or find other problems. That's the way then for a bureaucratic agency to continue to exist. Now when it comes to reforming, this might be beneficial to a bureaucratic agency, or it could actually create other problems. So combining agencies, privatization, transparency are ways to reform a bureaucratic agency. So for example, to combine agencies, does there really need to be ground troops found in both the Army and the Navy? We probably all know that the Army has ground troops, soldiers on the ground. But the Navy also has ground troops, right? The Marine Corps. So if you have those two, why does one have to be in the Navy and the other one in the Army? Why not combine them both in the Army? But as we can imagine, that's considerable area of resistance within the Department of the Navy. And this was only first proposed in the 1950s. It didn't get anywhere and probably will not get anywhere. So even though it might make sense to reform a bureaucratic agency, you're asking one part of the bureaucracy to give up power. That's not really very likely. And so while it might be a good way to reform a bureaucracy, it may just not be acceptable to all the organizations within that process. Privatization, maybe this will work. Maybe some of you are thinking about writing your research paper on this. So in this case, instead of having the bureaucracy do a particular job, you turn it over to a private organization that may still need to answer to the bureaucracy. But it's not using federal or state bureaucrats. So the one thing that privatization certainly does is reduce the number of bureaucrats because they're now private employees. It does not necessarily mean that it will save money because you're now paying the money to the private company. The company, if it is more efficient, may be a way then of using the private company instead of the bureaucracy. But one thing's for sure, you have to then pay the private company. They're the ones that are going to be getting the contract. So we can see that maybe it's helpful, maybe not necessarily in all cases, but the use of privatization is a way to reform a bureaucratic agency. Another way is through transparency. So we had three ways. You could combine an agency, you could privatize it, or you could provide more transparency. So in other words, you just have the bureaucratic agency that's going to have town hall meetings, or it's going to be upfront in a way in describing its job and explains to the public, to the stakeholders, what it's doing in any particular time. The big question there, of course, is can all bureaucracies afford transparency? Are there not bureaucracies in which the job that the bureaucracy is there to do would be harmed if it had to be transparent? So by the very nature of the Central Intelligence Agency, for it to be successful, it can't be transparent, at least in some cases. Now, maybe that's the argument it's making, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct. But how do we know that? We as citizens. And so that's where it can be pretty complex to say it's in the best interest of the CIA, the NSA, the Department of the Navy, and lots of other organizations to share with the public what it's doing. That may not necessarily work even for the public to know, because it now harms the ability of this bureaucratic agency to do its job. So we're left with looking at all the possibilities of reforming bureaucracy as perhaps not always a good answer to the success or the changing the culture of a bureaucratic agency. Now, when we look at bureaucracy, we also see that they have to put a policy into action, and that's what implementation is. And when you read through this page, you'll see the definition that the text has for implementation. And what we can determine here is that while those make a policy, a decision, when they do that, are they considering the ability of a bureaucratic agency to carry out that policy? Can they carry it out? So it's one thing to write up a policy of fighting a war in the desert. It's another to have the soldiers and Marines there in that desert to carry out that policy, to implement that policy. So what is taken into consideration if you're in an area that gets up to 120 degrees and of course would be even hotter if you're inside a tank? The amount of water that's needed for the soldiers and Marines, the use of sand and the heat and what it might mean for equipment. And so there you have these kinds of issues that have to be taken into consideration when you have these soldiers involved in a policy. So another area to consider when it comes to implementation. Who's writing the policy and how do they know how successful that policy can be carried out? The importance of implementation. Implementation the same way there for teaching. When you write a school policy, when you write an education policy, are these the same people who are going to be carrying it out and dealing with young people? Let's say if it's in grade school education, and are you understanding what it might mean to maintain time management in a daily activity for students and involved there in carrying out an education policy? So the use of implementation from a military point of view and from an education point of view. Some bureaucratic agencies are just more successful and more popular than others. This is showing you here the symbol of really one of the most popular bureaucratic agencies that we have here in the United States, the Social Security Administration. In one way, it's perhaps understandable that they're popular. I mean, after all, they're the ones who are carrying out, by and large, giving people benefits, benefits that perhaps they at least can conclude that they've earned to some level. But it means then that they're catching people in happy times overall, and that can be a reason why the Social Security Administration is popular. On the other hand, you have organizations that perhaps are not quite as popular, like the Federal Emergency Management Agency. But FEMA might be put in a position where it's just very, very difficult to make people happy because they're finding people in unhappy situations. They've been displaced from their homes. They've lost a lot of important material goods. Maybe they've actually lost family members. The possibility that then they can really be happy on wherever they're located, it's probably not going to happen. That's not necessarily the fault of FEMA, but it could be that FEMA is really in an impossible situation, and that's reflected in the way people might view that organization. The longer they have to deal with FEMA, the less they may like FEMA. And that's reflected if you just look at the responsibilities of FEMA. Here we can see it might be really difficult to accomplish this in a way that would satisfy a lot of people. So when we look at the use of bureaucracies, we can think about whistleblowers, and this comes back then to think about media leaks that we brought out in Chapter 7, the media. Here we're looking at the importance there of people who work within a bureaucracy. Let's consider the dilemma here. What is the most important responsibility of a bureaucratic employee, a bureaucrat? Is it their job to follow the responsibilities and the rules and the culture of that bureaucratic agency? Or is it their responsibility to uphold what they think are the correct behaviors within the Constitution or within human decency? And so is it necessary at that time to betray a bureaucratic agency? So if you're being asked to do something that you find to be illegal, to be unconstitutional, or to be immoral, is it your responsibility to still follow the guidelines within the bureaucratic agency? Or is it your responsibility at that time, like Edward Snowden believed, as you can see his picture here on the left, to go ahead and go to the media? And in this case, he blew the whistle on the NSA. He was a contractor for the National Security Agency and believed they were violating the Fourth Amendment. Is that in fact the higher responsibility of a bureaucrat? So I'm just leaving that there for you to consider, and the importance of a whistleblower. There's some really powerful jobs within the bureaucracy, and I want to just, we have a couple more slides here, just want to stress that, to think about. What if this is your job? You were to go out and you can consider looking at these individuals here. In fact, if you look at the picture, there's the gentleman there with on the back of his shirt, NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board. So their job is to review the crash of every plane and try to determine what has caused that crash. That's their job. They're called out to do that. You can imagine that there's going to be some pushback or persuasion by airline companies to argue that it was a pilot error, not the manufacturing of the plane that caused the crash. Not a design failure, but a pilot error. And so that's up to the NTSB to try to make that determination. So there's a lot of important people and many people and money involved in the outcome of their decision. Just to remind us of the importance of these bureaucratic agencies. When you look at a plane accident, there's three ways of making that determination. What caused the accident? Human error, machine error, or the environment, just the structure of how that plane was used. For example, there was a plane crash something like 20 years ago by a company that's out of business now called ValueJet, in which the storage of oxygen canisters within the bowels of the plane were not properly stored, and it led to a fire, and the plane was on fire in the air, and it was not able to get back in time before a crash. And so unfortunately it was a horrible accident, and that was an environmental error. We can imagine those don't happen that often. So mainly the debate is between machine error and human error, and that's what the NTSB has to make a determination. So we can see a lot of importance there for a bureaucratic agency. And when we look at bureaucratic agencies, how do we review the activities of a bureaucratic agency? And that comes back then to, this is why you have inspector generals within bureaucratic agencies, to make sure that they're above board. But that's not always easy to do that. So the conclusion in the Latin phrase, in Roman times, which is still with us, who will watch the watchers? How do we make that determination? So there's a lot of complexities, as we can see here, with bureaucratic agencies. Well, that's the last of our, well, no, our next to last, I should say, our penultimate recording. Sorry if I jumped the gun there a bit. We have one more recording which will be on the Supreme Court. So here we are at the conclusion for Bureaucracy, Chapter 14. We'll be turning our attention to Chapter 15 next.